The world had fallen quiet in a way that was almost unbearable. Cities that once roared with life now lay abandoned, their towering structures broken and hollow like the rib cages of fallen beasts. Sidewalks, once crowded with rushing feet and laughter, were now cracked and swallowed by creeping vines. The air itself seemed heavier, as if it mourned the loss of the people who had vanished. Nature was reclaiming everything at a frightening speed. Trees grew wild through shattered windows, and birds made nests in the empty frames of cars left to rust. It was as if the earth had decided to erase the memory of humanity's brief dominion. Buildings leaned precariously, their faded signs swinging in the wind with soft, eerie creaks. Shops, schools, homes, all were frozen in time, untouched but abandoned, like artifacts of a forgotten civilization. Those who had survived the Great Collapse did so quietly, hiding in the shadows of what had been. They rarely spoke and traveled only when necessary, moving like ghosts between the ruins. Every sound was a risk. Every step could mean danger. Hope had shriveled into something so small it barely existed anymore, hidden deep in the hearts of those who still clung to life. The silence was not just the absence of noise. It was a heavy, suffocating presence. Without the hum of cities, the distant chatter of crowds, or the familiar sounds of life, people had been left alone with their fears. Loneliness gnawed at them like an unseen predator. In that endless stillness, memories became painful. Thinking about what life used to be was almost worse than facing the endless, empty days ahead. Children born after the fall had never known the old world. They played quietly with makeshift toys, their laughter soft and uncertain, as if they were unsure whether joy was still allowed. Their parents, the few who had survived to raise them, carried faces worn by grief and hunger. They spoke of hope only in whispers, if at all, because to speak of it too loudly might shatter what little remained. Every sunrise felt like a battle won. Every nightfall felt like a surrender to fear. The survivors measured their lives not in days or years, but in heartbeats and breaths, each one a fragile miracle in a world that seemed determined to forget them. And yet, even in that near-complete silence, some still listened. Some still scanned the abandoned radios, whispered into broken receivers, or sent out messages in bottles of static and prayer. They hoped, though they no longer expected, that someone might answer. Somewhere beyond the horizon, perhaps someone else was still fighting. Perhaps someone had not given up. In this world drowning in silence, even the faintest sound could become a lifeline. Even the smallest flicker of hope could set a heart alight. But for now, the silence ruled. And in that silence, the world waited. It waited for a sign. It waited for a change. It waited for the relentless soldiers to come. It began with a whisper too faint for most to hear. In a world ruled by silence, even the softest noise could feel like an earthquake. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the ruins, an old radio came to life. At first, it was only static, the usual hollow, meaningless sound that filled abandoned rooms. But then, buried deep within the noise, a voice emerged. The message was broken and crackling, but the words were unmistakable. If you are alive, if you can hear this, help is coming. Hold on. People who had given up listening suddenly found themselves frozen, straining to catch every word. Those huddled in cold basements, those hidden deep in the woods, those living day to day in crumbling shells of houses, they heard it. It was as if the entire world, in its darkest moment, had been waiting for that single breath of life. The message repeated itself every hour, steady and unwavering. There were no promises of riches, no grand speeches, only the raw, simple truth that someone still cared enough to reach out. They called themselves the Relentless Soldiers, a name that carried both strength and hope. No one knew exactly who they were or where they came from. Some said they were former military units who refused to quit. Others believed they were just ordinary people who had banded together when the rest of the world fell apart. It did not matter who they were. It only mattered that they existed. The news traveled quickly, passed from whisper to whisper, from fire pit conversations to late-night secret gatherings. Survivors who had not spoken aloud for months found themselves telling others, retelling the words they had heard over the radio. A spark had been lit, and in a place that had known only darkness, it spread like wildfire. Some were skeptical. They had been hurt too many times before. They had seen false hopes crush even the strongest hearts. But even the skeptics found themselves listening, secretly waiting, secretly wanting to believe. The relentless soldiers spoke of gathering points, places where survivors could go and find safety. It was a dangerous idea. Traveling was risky, and many places had become hunting grounds for desperate souls. But the idea of staying hidden, living only to survive another day, had worn thin. People were tired of merely existing. They wanted to live again. For the first time in what felt like forever, choices had to be made. Would they stay in their broken shelters and continue their slow fade into nothingness? Or would they dare to hope, dare to move, and follow a voice they had never seen, a voice that promised something more? The signal, scratchy and uneven, kept pulsing through the night. It was a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, a single voice could be a torch. A single promise could be a path forward. The world had heard the call. Now, it only remained to be seen who would answer. The decision to move was never easy. For many, it meant leaving behind what little they had managed to protect. Shelters built from scraps, hidden safe places known only to them, fragile routines that had kept them alive. But something stronger than fear had begun to grow. Hope, once a dying ember, now flickered stubbornly in their hearts. Across the wastelands and broken towns, small groups of survivors began their journeys. Some traveled alone, silent and wary, weapons clutched tightly to their sides. Others moved in cautious clusters, sharing supplies and keeping careful watch over one another. Every step away from the safety of the familiar felt like walking a tightrope stretched over a deep abyss. The landscape was unforgiving. Roads were choked with abandoned vehicles, many stripped bare or burned. Forests, once places of peace, had become wild and unpredictable, hiding both natural dangers and human threats. Bridges had collapsed into rivers swollen with debris. Cities had become labyrinths of shadows and crumbling stone, where danger lurked around every corner. Survivors learned quickly that not all who roamed the world were seeking hope. Some had turned savage, ruled by desperation and cruelty. Trust was a rare and precious thing, given only after careful judgment, and sometimes not at all. Encounters with others were tense, filled with cautious words and ready hands. The weather, too, became an enemy. Fierce storms tore across the land without warning, flooding fields and tearing down what little remained standing. Blistering heat dried up streams, and bitter cold seeped into bones during the nights. Nature, left unchecked, seemed almost intent on keeping them from reaching whatever sanctuary the signal had promised. And yet through all of it, they pressed on. Old, worn maps were passed from hand to hand. Symbols were scratched onto stones or painted onto walls to mark safe paths or warn of dangers. Children were carried on backs or pulled along in broken wagons. Elders, too frail to walk far, were pushed forward in salvaged wheelchairs or supported by younger arms. Each step forward was an act of faith. Every mile crossed was a quiet declaration that they would not let the darkness have the final word. There were moments when it would have been easier to give up, when hunger gnawed so fiercely that it brought tears, when the cold made fingers too numb to grip a weapon, when loss struck and there was no time to mourn, but the memory of the voice on the radio. That steady, relentless promise kept them moving. In the eyes of those traveling the long road, something fierce had begun to burn. It was not the old world they were chasing, not a return to what had been lost. It was the chance to build something new, something better, on the ashes of the past. And somewhere beyond the wastelands, the relentless soldiers were waiting. The gathering point was not what anyone had imagined. It was not a shining city or a massive stronghold. Instead, it was a forgotten airfield at the edge of a ruined town, its runways cracked and overgrown with weeds. Rusted hangars sagged under the weight of years, and the control tower leaned slightly, like a tired sentinel who refused to fall. But it was alive. As the survivors approached, they saw the signs. Watchtowers built from scrap metal and wood, manned by figures wearing armor patched together from the remnants of 100 battles. Fires burned safely within makeshift barricades, their smoke curling into the sky like a signal to the weary. There were people here, real, breathing people, standing guard, tending fires, mending walls. The relentless soldiers had made their stand. When the first group of travelers emerged from the tree line, there was a tense moment. Weapons were raised, orders barked, the air thick with the possibility of violence. But then came a voice, steady and sure, through a battered loudspeaker. "You are safe here. Lower your weapons. No harm will come to you." It felt almost impossible to trust. For so long, every stranger had been a threat. Every promise had been a trap. Yet, one by one, the survivors obeyed. Exhausted, filthy, half-starved, they lowered their weapons and stepped forward. The relentless soldiers moved quickly but carefully. They searched the newcomers, not with cruelty, but with a firm need to protect their people. Injuries were treated with real medical supplies, not dirty rags. Food, though simple, was shared freely. Water, clean, sweet water, was offered without hesitation. The survivors wept openly, not out of sadness, but because they had forgotten what kindness looked like. The leaders of the relentless soldiers, a small group of hardened men and women, greeted each new arrival personally. They did not offer grand speeches or hollow promises. They spoke simply, explaining the rules of their camp. Protect each other, work together, and never give up. No one was above the law, and no one would be left behind. There was a sense of purpose here that had long been missing from the broken world. Everyone had a role to play, whether it was guarding the walls, growing food in rooftop gardens, or repairing salvaged equipment. Children were taught to read, to plant seeds, to hope. Elders shared their wisdom, telling stories of the world before and offering guidance for the world to come. It was not perfect. It was rough, raw, and fragile, but it was real. For the first time in what felt like forever, survivors felt something they had thought was lost. Not just safety, not just survival. They felt belonging. As night fell over the airfield, fires blazed against the darkness. Laughter, soft but growing stronger, drifted into the night. The world beyond the barricades was still broken, still dangerous. But here, inside this small patch of stubborn hope, humanity had begun to rise again. And the real battle was only beginning. For a brief moment, it seemed peace had found a home at the airfield. Every day brought new survivors through the broken fence line, and with them came new skills, new dreams, and new strength. The relentless soldiers worked tirelessly, teaching people how to fight, how to grow food, how to believe in something bigger than themselves. But peace was never meant to last without a fight. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, the first warning came. A scout, breathless and bleeding, stumbled into camp with news that sent a chill through even the bravest hearts. A large group was moving toward them, not survivors looking for sanctuary, but a marauding gang known only as the Red Fangs. The Red Fangs had no interest in rebuilding. They thrived in the chaos, feeding off fear and destruction. Wherever they passed, only ashes and broken bodies remained. They were ruthless, well-armed, and worst of all, organized. Rumors said they once were soldiers too, but had chosen power over principle. The leaders of the relentless soldiers gathered immediately. Maps were spread out on a battered table, strategies whispered between tired, determined faces. They knew their numbers were fewer, their weapons older, but they had something the Red Fangs could never understand. Unity, purpose, and a burning refusal to let the darkness win. The camp was transformed overnight. Barricades were reinforced with anything they could find. Abandoned cars, concrete slabs, even old airplane wings. Traps were laid out along the paths leading to the airfield. Patrols doubled, eyes constantly sweeping the horizon. Everyone had a part to play. Children were hidden deep within the safest areas. The elders, many of whom had once known war, helped prepare supplies and patch up armor. Every able-bodied person trained with whatever weapon they could wield. Rifles, axes, even sharpened sticks. Fear hung heavy in the air, but it was a different kind of fear than before. It was not the fear of being hunted like animals. It was the fear of losing something precious, something they had only just begun to build. The relentless soldiers made no promises of an easy victory. They spoke the hard truth. Some would fall, but their fight would not be for nothing. Every second bought would give another life a chance to escape, another hope a chance to be realized. As night fell again, the fires inside the camp burned brighter than ever, casting long shadows over the faces of those preparing for battle. They knew the Red Fangs would come under the cover of darkness. They knew this would be a fight to the very end. But they also knew something far more important. This was their home now, and they would not let it be taken without a fight. The attack began just after midnight. The first sign was the sound, a distant rumble that grew louder with each heartbeat, like a coming storm. Then came the shouting, the blaring horns, and the roar of engines as the Red Fangs charged toward the camp with reckless fury. The defenders were ready. Explosives buried along the paths exploded with deafening force, sending up walls of dirt and fire that broke the first wave of attackers. As the Red Fangs stumbled forward, dazed but furious, the relentless soldiers unleashed their defense. Arrows rained down from the watchtowers. Rifles cracked through the night. Every defender fought with a grim focus, each knowing that every second they held the line meant another chance for their future to survive. The Red Fangs were brutal. They threw themselves against the barricades, hacking at the defenses with sledgehammers and battering rams. They shouted curses and promises of destruction, trying to break the spirits of those inside. But the camp stood firm. For every fighter who fell, another stepped up to take their place. Amid the chaos, leaders moved along the walls, shouting orders and encouragement. Supplies were rushed to the front lines. Wounded were dragged to safety and patched up, only to return to the fight if they could still stand. There was no room for hesitation, no time for fear. The battle raged for hours, a swirling storm of noise, fire, and raw willpower. Flames lit the night as parts of the barricade caught fire, but survivors formed lines with buckets and blankets to beat them back. Every corner of the camp became a battleground. Every soul became a warrior. Inside the camp, children huddled together, clutching hands and whispering prayers they barely remembered. The elders stood nearby, makeshift weapons ready, their faces carved from stone. No one would be taken easily. Then, just as the defenders began to falter, a new cry rose above the din. Reinforcements, smaller groups of survivors from nearby areas, drawn by the sounds of the battle, had come to help. They charged into the Red Fangs from the sides, catching them off guard and sowing confusion in their ranks. It was enough. The relentless soldiers rallied, pushing back with renewed fury. The Red Fangs, realizing they could not win, began to retreat, dragging their wounded and shouting threats into the night. The defenders did not chase them. They knew better. Their victory was not in crushing their enemies, but in surviving, in standing together. When the sun finally rose, it revealed a camp battered but unbroken. The ground was scared, the barricades damaged, and the people exhausted beyond words. But they were alive. And more than that, they had proven to themselves and the world that hope was no longer a whisper in the dark. It was a roar. The battle was over, but the weight of it still hung heavy over the airfield. Ashes drifted across the broken ground like black snow. Survivors moved through the camp in a quiet procession, tending to the wounded, repairing the barricades, and gathering the fallen. Every loss was a heavy blow, not just to the heart, but to the future they had fought so hard to protect. Still, no one gave in to despair. They buried their dead with care and honor, marking each grave with stones and simple words carved into pieces of wood. Songs were sung, not grand or joyful, but steady and filled with a strength that could not be broken. It was a reminder to all who remained that the fight had meaning, that their sacrifices built something larger than any one life. In the days that followed, the camp came alive again. It was not the same as before. It was stronger. Survivors who had once been strangers now worked side by side like family. They shared stories of their loved ones, dreams they still carried, and memories they refused to let die. New watchtowers rose where old ones had fallen. Gardens that had been trampled during the battle were replanted with even more care. The airfield itself seemed to stand a little taller, as if the land itself recognized the courage of those who fought to save it. Leaders of the Relentless soldiers gathered everyone one evening as the sun set, bathing the sky in streaks of orange and gold. Their faces were marked with scars and fatigue, but their eyes burned with determination. "This," one of them said, his voice clear over the hushed crowd, "is what it means to be human. To stand together when everything tries to tear us apart. To choose hope over fear. To rebuild, even when the ashes are still warm." The crowd listened in silence, some holding hands, others simply standing shoulder to shoulder. In that moment, it did not matter where they had come from, what mistakes they had made, or what fears they carried. They were one people now, united by something deeper than blood, by choice, by courage, and by hope. Plans were made for stronger defenses. Patrols were sent farther out to warn of any returning threats. Scouts searched for other groups of survivors to bring into the fold. Every small act of rebuilding was an act of defiance against the darkness that had once ruled their world. At night, the fires burned higher than ever, not in fear, but in celebration. Laughter returned, hesitant at first, then stronger. Children played again in the dusty fields. Music, real music, played on salvaged instruments, drifted into the air like a promise. The world was still broken beyond the camp's walls. Dangers still lurked in the ruined cities and endless forests. But here, at this small patch of earth defended by relentless hearts, a future was being forged. Hope was no longer gone. Hope was alive. The days that followed the battle were not without their challenges. There were scars to heal, both physical and emotional. There were losses to mourn, and hard work to do. But the spirit of the people at the airfield had shifted in ways that no attack could destroy. They had tasted the bitterness of war, but also the sweetness of survival, and they would never take that for granted again. With the red fangs driven back, the relentless soldiers and their new allies turned their attention to what lay ahead. The world outside the camp was still a wasteland, but within the walls, there was a promise of something more, something real. The leaders knew they couldn't rebuild everything at once. The roads were still unsafe. The cities were still ruins. But that didn't matter. They had something that no enemy, no storm, and no disaster could take away: the will to survive, and the will to rebuild. One morning, as the sun broke through the clouds, the first group of survivors set out to explore further. They were not warriors, not soldiers, but people who had lost everything and now carried something precious with them: hope. They traveled along old highways, following the faint trails of others who had once been, and perhaps still could be, part of this new world. It wasn't long before they found another camp. It was small, a collection of scattered survivors just beginning to rebuild. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. And that's what mattered. They shared stories, supplies, and plans. The world was big, and the road ahead would be long, but the connections they made, the bonds of shared struggle, gave them a strength that could not be underestimated. As the months passed, more groups joined the airfield, and the community there expanded. The soldiers, once hardened and distant, became leaders in their own right, guiding others through the trials of rebuilding and survival. The camp turned into a settlement, and the settlement began to thrive. There were children who would grow up in this new world, who would never know the fear and pain of the past. There were farmers who sowed crops, teachers who educated, and engineers who worked with the remnants of the old world's technology to create something new. The old world, the one that had crumbled under the weight of its own failures, was gone. But the people who had survived, who had risen from the ashes, carried the lessons of that past. They understood that strength came not from power or control, but from unity, from trust, and from an unbreakable belief in tomorrow. Years later, the first new city stood tall on the horizon. A city born not of war, but of hope, of resilience, and of the relentless spirit of those who refused to let the world fall into darkness. And as the sun set on that city, casting its golden light across the land, the survivors gathered together, not as broken people clinging to the past, but as the builders of a new future. Hope was no longer a distant dream. It was a reality, and the world was ready to begin again.